Hello, my name is John Moyer, and I want to welcome you to the NIH Office of Disease Prevention's Methods Mind the Gap webinar series. This series explores research design, measurement, intervention, data analysis, and other methods of interest to prevention science. Our goal is to engage the prevention research community in thought-provoking discussions, to promote the use of the best available methods, and to support the development of better methods. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping items. You can submit questions during the webinar via the chat pod. You'll need to open the pod by hovering your cursor at the bottom of the Zoom window and then clicking on the chat icon. Please direct your questions to hosts and panelists. We will open the floor to questions that have been submitted via the Zoom chat pod at the conclusion of today's talk. The slides and video recording will be posted on our website, prevention.nih.gov/mindthegap, in approximately 2 weeks. Lastly, we would appreciate your feedback about today's webinar. Upon closing, you will be asked to complete an evaluation. We would appreciate your feedback as it will help us improve this webinar series. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. David M. Murray, Associate Director for Prevention and Director of the Office of Disease Prevention.
Thank you, Dr. Moyer. Today's speakers are Dr. Linda Collins and Dr. Jillian Strayhorn. Dr. Linda Collins is Professor of Social and Behavioral Sciences and Biostatistics in the New York University School of Global Public Health. She is also Director of the Center for Advancement and Dissemination of Intervention Optimization. She is one of the original developers of the multiphase optimization strategy, or MOST. Her work focuses on enhancing, extending, applying, and disseminating MOST. Dr. Jillian Strayhorn is an assistant professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the New York University School of Global Public Health and associate director of the Center for Advancement and Dissemination of Intervention Optimization. She's a quantitative methodologist whose work focuses on the multi-criteria decision-making that goes into successfully optimizing behavioral and biobehavioral and biomedical interventions for public health impact. Her work is motivated by the goal of identifying and advancing high-value interventions that are not only effective, but also efficient and equitable in their effectiveness. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Collins and Dr. Strayhorn.
Thank you, David. It's really great to be here and to be here with my colleague, Jillian Strayhorn. I'd like to give a brief overview today because we're going to be dividing things up. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to intervention optimization via the multi-phase optimization strategy, MOST, and then Jillian's going to take over and talk about decision-making and optimizing for equitability. You may not realize this, but Earth has a twin planet. It's exactly like Earth in every way, except this twin planet, Terra, does not have behavioral or biobehavioral intervention. So here's a story of these two planets. Planet Earth, as you know, uses the classical treatment package approach for the most part. In the classical treatment package approach, there's some number of intervention components. I have 5 here, but it could be any number of components. They are assembled into an intervention package, and that package is then evaluated by means of the classical evaluation randomized controlled trial. This is a design everyone is familiar with. This is a pretty simple experimental design, although there's a lot of subtleties to it. And in this experimental design, participants are randomly assigned either to participate in the intervention or to participate in some appropriate control group, and then the means of those two conditions are compared. And of course, I just want to point out that the vast majority of intervention research that's done on planet Earth uses the classical evaluation RCT to the exclusion of other experimental designs. Now, Terra has been watching Earth, and they're wondering how can they get behavioral and biobehavioral interventions, and what would be the appropriate methodology to go about this. So let's take a quick rocket ship to Terra and take a look at what they are currently doing. Terra's objectives are, first, to build a coherent knowledge base about what intervention strategies work for whom, and why. They want to use this knowledge to develop interventions that have immediate high public health impact. And of course, they want to keep making improvements in these interventions over time. Those seem like pretty straightforward objectives. So Tara's plan is to start with the classical treatment package approach that they've seen used on Earth for all these years, and then reevaluate it after 5 years. So 5 years goes by, and now Tara is ready to evaluate how that worked. So here's what Tara concluded after 5 years of using the classical treatment package approach on their planet. First, they wanted to look at that first objective, building a coherent knowledge base. They found that when an intervention demonstrated a detectable effect, it wasn't clear to them why it worked. And even more frustratingly, when an intervention did not show a significant effect or a detectable effect, it wasn't clear why it did not work. And so they concluded that they were not successfully building a coherent knowledge base, which was disappointing to them. The second objective, immediate high public health impact. They noticed that most of the interventions they developed were too expensive, too complex, and often just too burdensome for staff and participants to be implemented. And they couldn't figure out a way to fix this without risking making the interventions ineffective. It seemed like an obvious thing to do would be to remove a component or two, but they didn't know whether these were the components that perhaps were driving the effect that they had observed. And so they didn't want to mess with the interventions. And of course, if an intervention is never implemented, it has zero public health impact. And so the conclusion was they were not successfully achieving a high public health impact. And for the third objective, improvements, well, they found that evaluation in a classical evaluation RCT did not reveal an intervention's strong and weak parts. So the next steps to make improvements were frustratingly unclear. And so their conclusion was that they were really not set up to make ongoing improvements. And without those improvements, there was not much hope of achieving objectives 1 and 2 either. So the people of Tara decided that they needed a new research paradigm. They looked back over the last 30 years or so on Tara, and they noticed that there had been a lot of progress made in a number of other fields. They remembered what flip phones used to be like, how primitive they seem now compared to the amazing phones that they have. On Tara, like on Earth, they had the compact portable, which was sort of semi-portable because it's actually really heavy. And now we have wonderful, very, very light laptops we can take everywhere. And they have BMWs on Tara. And their BMW in the mid-1980s got 21 miles per gallon, and they find that today's model gets 29 miles per gallon, and plus is a much safer car with airbags all over the place. So they asked themselves, what are those fields doing that we are not doing in intervention science? And the conclusion they came to was that all of those fields were making use of this concept of optimization, the process of strategically balancing a set of prioritized criteria in order to achieve the best outcome. Well, optimization, of course, comes straight out of industrial engineering, and behavioral science is not industrial engineering. So the people of Tara decided that they would integrate ideas from a number of different areas. So here's their new framework for development, optimization, and evaluation of interventions. It starts with principles of optimization from industrial engineering. It also includes ideas from behavioral science, evidence-based strategies. It includes ideas from health economics, management of resources. It integrates ideas from decision science, methods for making difficult trade-offs strategically, and also implementation science, methods for achieving implementability. This is Tara's new framework for development, optimization, and evaluation of interventions. The objective of their framework is to develop an intervention that both demonstrates a significant effect in an evaluation RCT and is immediately implementable. So this requires strategically balancing effectiveness against other considerations: affordability, scalability, and efficiency to achieve what can be called intervention ease. You achieve this balance by optimizing, by weighing all these different considerations, and only then go on to an evaluation RCT. Terra's new framework is a discovery-driven and iterative approach, which is much more aligned with how we were all trained to be scientists. Uses a variety of experimental designs as needed, including the classical evaluation RCT, along with many other types of experimental designs, depending on exactly what research question is at hand. And woven into this framework is the expectation that intervention improvement is an ongoing process. And on Terra, they even started assigning version numbers to interventions in much the same way that version numbers are assigned to software as it keeps improving. Now, could Planet Terra's approach work on Earth? Well, let's take the spaceship back to Earth and see. Of course, the framework that I said was developed on Terra, as you know, was developed here on Earth, and it's the multi-phase optimization strategy most. So I'm going to walk us through the schematic of the multi-phase optimization strategy. This is just a way to kind of set the stage for Jillian's presentation about decision-making. There are three phases, multi-phase, so there's three phases: preparation, optimization, and evaluation. In the preparation phase, the investigator lays the groundwork for optimization. Now, a lot of this in the preparation phase, not terribly different from what you already know. You devise or revise a conceptual model, although in most this is a bit more detailed than you might be accustomed to in ways we can talk about if you're interested. You identify a set of candidate intervention components. And notice I'm calling them candidate components. That's because they're candidates for inclusion in the intervention. They might or might not make it into the intervention, depending on how they perform in the optimization trial, which I'm going to get to in a moment. Any pilot work is conducted in the preparation phase. And another part of the preparation phase is identification of an optimization objective. The optimization objective is an operational definition of what you're trying to do in optimization. For example, if you know that there's going to be an upper limit on implementation costs of $400 a person, you might be interested in identifying the intervention that gives the best expected outcome for no more than $400 a person. That's just one example. There are many, many different possible types of optimization objectives. The next phase is the optimization phase, in which the investigator builds the optimized intervention. One activity that's really different here from what you might be accustomed to is conducting an optimization RCT. This is a different kind of randomized controlled trial with very different logical underpinnings as compared to the evaluation RCT. There's a lot of work going on in this area now, development of different kinds of experimental designs, but here are some examples: the factorial experiment, the fractional factorial experiment, the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial, the micro-randomized trial, and so on. There are, as I said, many, many alternatives to choose from, depending on what kind of intervention you're optimizing and exactly what you need to accomplish. Once the optimization RCT has been conducted, the data have been analyzed, and you have the results, you use those results to identify the intervention that meets the optimization objective. Then you can ask the question, is this intervention expected to be sufficiently effective? If it is, you can go on to an evaluation RCT. If it is not, you may want to go back to the drawing board, but note that if you find, for example, that you don't get enough components that are performing well, and that's why you don't want to go to an evaluation RCT, you know what works and what does not work, and that's important. So to go back to the three criteria, three objectives that we talked about before, to build a base of scientific knowledge about what works and what doesn't work, for whom and why, that is done when the optimization RCT is conducted. You leverage that knowledge to develop high-impact interventions when you do the decision-making that Jillian is going to talk about. And the continual optimization principle says that optimization is an ongoing process. Once an intervention has been optimized, you should re-optimize it. You should keep doing optimization trials and optimizing again and again. Notice that when people develop cars or laptop computers or cell phones or any really of the other consumer products we're accustomed to, they don't develop it and say, we're done. They continually improve it. And this also could be done with interventions. And now I want to turn things over to Jillian.
Great, thank you. So one of the key points that I want to emphasize today is that the field of intervention optimization is in active development and continual advancement itself. This means that the methodological toolkit within MOST is constantly building and evolving. So today we are highlighting our new work taking initial steps to incorporate methodology for considering intervention equitability in the optimization process. In just a moment, I'll get into more about what I mean by this, but first, let's consider in more detail the decision-making that goes into selecting an optimized intervention. So here's a hypothetical example. In this hypothetical example, the investigator wants to optimize an intervention to improve medication adherence in a population of interest. They have identified 4 candidate intervention components that are hypothesized to contribute to improved medication adherence, and they want to identify the combination of these candidate components that is effective and readily implementable, or that strategically balances effectiveness with cost, in this case, say, defined in terms of the money needed to deliver a particular intervention. So this investigator decides to test the individual and combined effects of the candidate intervention components using a full 2 to the 4th factorial RCT. With 4 candidate intervention components, participants are randomized to 16 different experimental conditions. Now, notably, these conditions should not be considered arms. The experiment relies on comparisons among combinations of conditions to estimate effects, not comparisons among individual conditions. So, for example, to estimate a main effect for motivational interviewing sessions, a mean for conditions 1 through 8 is compared to a mean for conditions 9 through 16. Now, if I do some toggling between these 2 slides, you might notice that in each half of this design, the levels for the remaining factors are balanced. The main effect estimates the effect in this case for the presence of motivational interviewing versus the absence, averaging over the levels of the remaining factors. So a balanced factorial experiment offers a statistically efficient way of estimating main effects for and interaction effects among these different factors. Now, using the estimated main and interaction effects, this hypothetical investigator can estimate an expected outcome for each of the alternative versions of the intervention, with each different version containing some combination of these candidate intervention components, because again, these were just operationalized as presence versus absence factors. So in the scatter plot shown here, you can see 16 dots, 1 for each alternative version of the intervention. And here the components for simplicity are indicated with A, B, C, and D. The interventions are plotted according to their expected outcomes on the x-axis, where higher or farther right indicates better performance, better expected medication adherence. They are also plotted according to their costs for delivery, where higher or farther up indicates a larger delivery cost. The intervention with the best expected outcome in this case, this is using simulated data for this hypothetical example, is intervention A, B, C, D, or the intervention that contains all 4 of the candidate components. However, this is also the most expensive of the interventions to deliver, understandably. And so the solid line in this plot highlights the alternatives that can be considered value efficient because they produce expected outcomes without resource waste relative to the alternative intervention versions. Intervention ABC, for instance, which contains everything but the skill building sessions, is nearly as effective as intervention ABCD, and is considerably less expensive to deliver, something that could mean, say, that intervention ABC has the potential to be delivered to more individuals. So as the investigator thinks through these results, they may decide that intervention ABC is the intervention that accomplishes that best strategic balance that Linda was alluding to before of effectiveness and cost, suggesting that ABC might be the one that's the best contender for optimized intervention. Now, this sort of decision-making process uses methodology that we refer to as DAVE, Decision Analysis for Intervention Value Efficiency. We and our colleagues have recently written about this in health psychology. If you're interested in a more fleshed out example of this. But now let's turn to the topic of intervention equitability, starting with an important challenge. Many interventions are intended to be disseminated broadly, that is, delivered to a population of participants who vary in their relative social, environmental, and economic advantage. For these interventions, there are at least two key goals. First, to achieve effectiveness overall in terms of that expected mean outcome. But second, to achieve effectiveness equitably in terms of a distribution of outcomes. And it is possible for that first goal to be achieved when the second is not, say, because the intervention is really effective, but for just some people, say those who are high in socioeconomic status or otherwise already advantaged. And in these cases, broad dissemination of that intervention carries an important risk, namely that existing health disparities will increase. This is a phenomenon that has been termed intervention-generated inequality, when an intervention that is effective on a population level increases a health disparity. And it has unfortunately been documented in various areas of public health, for example, in smoking cessation interventions. So let's return to our hypothetical intervention. And suppose now that this investigator has reason to believe that the identified candidate intervention components are differentially likely to produce intervention-generated inequality. Say perhaps that motivational interviewing sessions are delivered in a clinic setting, and the investigator worries that individuals with more advantage who are already successfully engaged in healthcare or more readily engaged in healthcare will be more likely to benefit from this component. So maybe with that in mind, the investigator includes the navigator component, which is specifically hypothesized to support individuals in navigating the healthcare system and building trust, and to make the benefits of motivational interviewing sessions more fairly experienced. Now, recall there are 16 different possible versions of this intervention package. And with hypotheses like these, it's possible that these different intervention versions will vary both in terms of their overall effectiveness, in terms of medication adherence, but also in terms of the distribution of those benefits. There are 3 of the 16 possible intervention packages right here. In one, for instance, maybe all 4 components are included, and possibly the investigator's hypothesized balance of effects will play out. The tendency of motivational interviewing sessions to favor individuals with higher advantage is successfully buffered by the navigator, and so on. But remember that intervention that contains all 4 components was also the most expensive, and maybe with its expense, components are more likely to be cut ad hoc in the implementation of this intervention, threatening that delicate balance of component effects. In a different intervention package, say one that contains motivational interviewing sessions and peer support, perhaps that intervention has a really strong overall effect, but one that is concentrated among individuals with more advantage, raising that risk of generating inequality, and so on. All of these different possible versions of the intervention might offer different performance on these different criteria, with the criteria involving the overall effect versus the distribution of effects. Now, these results from the optimization RCT, which we saw before, summarize overall effectiveness in terms of the expected outcomes and also, of course, cost. These results do not incorporate consideration of the distribution of effects. So we can also quantify, using a health concentration index, the performance of these different intervention versions in terms of their relative tendency to distribute their effects evenly across the population or to concentrate effects among some portion of the population. Now, in these results, which again are simulated for illustration purposes, the interventions that fall at the far left of the plot have more tendency to concentrate their benefits among members of the population who are already advantaged, possibly indicating the potential to increase existing health disparities. So finally, we can bring all of this information together. The information about performance in terms of overall effectiveness and in terms of resource efficiency, and also in terms of the distribution of effects to identify intervention versions that balance the three. These results highlight a new solid frontier with interventions that may be worth considering. In this plot, net health value is on the y-axis. Net health value is a construct that effectively combines the performance that we saw before in terms of overall effectiveness and efficiency of resource use. Then on the x-axis, we see equitability, indicating negative performance, suggesting that possible tendency to increase existing health disparities. So the interventions on this line are those that are positive in their net health value on a population level, but we see that interventions AB and ABC are negative to slightly negative in terms of their performance in equitability, whereas intervention BC is on the positive side of equitability, indicating again that less tendency to concentrate among those who are already advantaged and raising less concern about intervention generated inequality. So what if intervention ABC were chosen as the optimized intervention? You may recall from before that intervention ABC was the intervention that was highlighted as a contender for the optimized intervention. In this case, because there was the strategic balance between overall effectiveness on the medication adherence outcome and efficiency of resource use. However, these results also identify this slight potential to concentrate effects among those who are more advantaged, suggesting that if funds were reallocated to intervention ABC and intervention ABC were distributed widely, there might be some small undesirable impact on existing health disparities. By contrast, if intervention BC were chosen as the optimized intervention, there would be less of this possibility. Now, one thing I'll emphasize here is that both versions of this decision-making methodology, this version that highlights the balance between overall effectiveness and cost on the y-axis, and this version that effectively combines those dimensions for net health value on the y-axis and presents equitability on the x-axis. All of this is agnostic as to the actual choice of optimized intervention. So it is the human decision makers, in this case, our hypothetical investigator, who's tasked with the choice of intervention to proceed with. And of course, there's no rule that the investigator has to pick one for further experimentation. It could be that there's reason to pick 2 interventions to proceed with, to experiment with further. Now, in just a bit, we'll turn to a question and answer period. But I'd like to also end with a few notes here. First of all, MOST is being applied to optimize multi-component interventions across a wide variety of areas of public health. It's being used currently by a large number of teams globally. And a number of these applications of MOST in practice are targeting health disparities. So this methodological work that is presented in its very initial stages today is by no means the only way that MOST can be applied to advance the larger mission of health equity. Instead, these methods are described as particularly relevant for the case in which the goal is to optimize an intervention that is to be disseminated broadly across a population that varies, raising new population level considerations. This particular methodology for this sort of strategic balancing is in active development. These are our very initial thoughts and our initial work. And there's a lot that still needs to be worked out about this. Most importantly, as I've noted several times, the work presented here is using simulated data to illustrate the potential. I would also like to acknowledge our key collaborator in this work, Dr. David Van Ness at Penn State University. Dr. Van Ness is a health economist who collaborated with Dr. Collins and me most recently in working on this. We had the great opportunity to work on this in producing a manuscript for prevention science, which is just recently available online, I'm excited to say. So if you would like to read more about this particular hypothetical example, we welcome you to do so. We also would like to encourage everyone to be in touch with us via CADIO, our Center for Advancement and Dissemination of Intervention Optimization at NYU, and via our sister center, the D3 Center, which has a particular focus on optimizing adaptive interventions. And for example, using designs like the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. CADIO's website has a number of resources about intervention optimization, both in terms of the introduction like Linda provided, and also more information about new developments, including this sort of work in methods for considering equitability. We also have a Coursera course on MOST that is available for free, and very recently a second course that is aimed at biostatisticians and methodologists. And finally, I encourage everyone to sign up for our newsletter and register for our webinars to keep up to date with some of the developments in MOST and join this ever-growing field of intervention optimization. I'll say my thank you as well to Dr. Collins and to the Office for Disease Prevention for inviting us to talk about this today, and we're excited to discuss questions.
Thank you both for your comments and the information that you provided. We've got lots of questions to discuss. Let's start with one that involves NIH. The MOST approach is quite different from the traditional approach to randomized clinical trials. Dr. Collins made a big point of that early on and saw that as an advantage. My question is, are NIH study sections receptive to applications that propose studies using the MOST approach? Are there particular study sections that investigators should target? And do you have advice for investigators who want to propose a study based on MOST, whose history is entirely writing traditional randomized clinical trials?
Oh, yes. That's a great question, or great series of questions. So if you had asked me this question even 10 years ago, I would have said, well, it is actually kind of hard to get one of these studies through a study section, but that has really changed. I mean, it used to be, well, going back, the first article on this was published in 2005. And the first few studies, reviewers were like, "Oh my God, this is from outer space. What are you even talking about?" Now it's really different. I think that these ideas are gradually becoming much more acceptable, and in fact, more and more people are coming to me with summary statements saying, "You didn't propose most, and you should have." So that's happening more and more. So I don't think there's any particular study section. I think this is just a sea change that's happening across all the study sections that review intervention type grant proposals. And if you are someone who has been trained primarily in the classical treatment package approach, which would be 95% of us or more, I recommend that you take one of our trainings to get started. If you look on the CADIO website, we do synchronous online trainings about twice a year. And the way that works is you have to complete the asynchronous online course that's on the Coursera website. And then we have several days of synchronous learning where you can ask questions and you do exercises in small groups. The whole purpose of the synchronous training is to prepare you to write a successful grant proposal based on intervention optimization.
Follow-up question, is it correct that you once told a colleague that your mission in life is to get all NIH trials to use the MOST approach?
Not necessarily all NIH trials, but my mission in life is to make MOST the standard, so that instead of people feeling like they have to justify using intervention optimization, if someone wants to go directly to an RCT using the classical treatment package approach, I would want them to have to justify that.
A question from one of our listeners. This process sounds wonderful, but where does the funding come from to repeatedly improve the intervention?
Yep, that's another great question. Repeatedly improving the intervention, that's more aspirational at this point. No one has done that yet. But I also would like to say, since I hope there are some NIH staffers, I think there probably are in the audience, a related question I get a lot is most takes so long. It takes too long. And so I guess I would ask, too expensive for what? Too long for what? For what goal exactly? If the goal is to just test a treatment package in an RCT or develop an intervention that's going to stay the same forever, then yeah, I mean, I guess then what we're proposing is too expensive. But if the goal is well, if you have that three-part goal that the people of Terra had of wanting to know what's going on inside the black box, to develop interventions with high impact and then keep making them higher and higher impact, then I think it's hard to argue that the treatment package approach is the way to do that. And I would respectfully ask NIH staffers to maybe think about that when you're setting funding priorities.
Fair advice. What activity codes would you suggest that investigators use if they want to develop an application based on MOST? Would that be the traditional R01? Would it be an R03? Would it be an R21? The NIH has a couple of hundred activity codes. Are there some that you use more often than others, or have you found, oh, you can use a variety?
You can use a variety. First, I'd like to say that there are many K awards of the various types of K awards where learning MOST and conducting a pilot that would lead right into an R01 to conduct an optimization trial, that's what is going on in those K awards. There are many, many of those. So the K is one. R01 is certainly, that's been used a lot, but it kind of depends on how much you want to do in one grant. I've seen, the R21 and the R03, and also, David, there's another one, I'm blanking on it. Is it an R32? There's one that supports development of an intervention. I've seen that one used to complete the preparation phase of most. And I've been involved in a number of center grants that have kind of been built, or center grants and program projects that have kind of been built around intervention optimization as an organizing principle.
I've lost my mute button. I think it's the R34 that you were thinking about.
R34. Yes, that's right. Thanks, David. Yeah.
And in fact, we had a question about, would this be most ideal for an R34? So I think your answer to that question is that is a good activity code to use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it depends on exactly what you're hoping to accomplish. If you've already had a K award, and then I think you would be able to do a lot of the same stuff that you would propose in an R34. So I would say go directly to the R01, but it just really depends on the exact circumstances.
Right. And the different institutes and centers at NIH have different funding levels. So as you're just a general bit of advice to investigators, as you're thinking about where to submit your application, try to get as much information as you can about what the various institutes and centers have as their funding level, and that might help you steer your application a bit. But I think you said earlier, Linda, that you had not found that some study sections were particularly good and others were dangerous. You found pretty good reception across a range of study sections.
That's been my experience anyway. Others may have other experiences, but Jillian, what has your experience been so far?
Yeah, mine has been very like yours. Yeah, so I would second that.
Great. One of our viewers asked or noted that factorial experiments are not known as super efficient. They're known to be rather large and involve more participants than, say, a two-factor design. So
that is a myth. That's a pervasive myth. And no, I've actually published a number of peer review articles reminding people of what Fisher told us, almost 100 years ago, about factorial experiments. They were originally developed because they're more efficient than conducting repeated RCTs. I know that's counterintuitive if you've been trained primarily in the evaluation RCT, and the reason for it, and we don't have time to go into it here, but the reason for it basically is that the logical underpinnings of an evaluation RCT are completely different from the logical underpinnings of an optimization RCT. And once you get the hang of it, it's really easy to see the difference between the two of them. But basically with an evaluation RCT, that's all about directly comparing the means of the experimental conditions. And in an optimization RCT, you're comparing combinations of experimental conditions to estimate the effects.
Question that's rather fundamental, and so let me give you this one. What is the benefit of the evaluation RCT following an optimization trial?
I always laugh when I get that. It's a great question, but I spent so many years trying to convince people that you need optimization trials, and now people are asking, well, do you need the evaluation trial? And I would actually say you probably don't always. Well, actually, you don't always need it, because once you've conducted the optimization RCT, there's really three possible outcomes. One is that maybe you don't have enough good, so to speak, components. And so you want to go back to the drawing board. So it would not be ethical to do an evaluation RCT under those circumstances. Another possible outcome is that the intervention looks promising, and so, but you're not sure. And in that case, you definitely would want to go ahead to an evaluation RCT. A third possibility is that the results of the optimization RCT are so strong that and positive that you don't need an evaluation RCT. And actually, we are working now on methodological, more Bayesian methodological approaches to assist the investigator in making that complex decision. That's kind of another type of decision that investigators have to make.
We're getting a number of questions about how do you do sample size calculations for the optimization phase. Can you offer guidance or suggestions regarding software or other tools?
Definitely. I'm going to punt that to Jillian, I think.
Sure. Yeah, so on the CADIO website, there are some resources. I believe in the chat that was mentioned that there's a SAS macro for sample size calculations. There also is an R package. It's in the most package. There's a function called factorial power plan. And personally, I always recommend that people play around, if they have any comfort with R, play around with that function to explore some of the sample size features of the factorial experiment. But I'll also note that specifically for optimization RCTs that are built around hypotheses about intervention-generated inequality, we have not yet worked out some of the sample size implications for this. As you can imagine, if you were to want to draw conclusions about performance in this sense, you would need a sample that is very diverse in terms of all of the dimensions of relative advantage you might want to consider. And so we have plans to work out those sorts of sample considerations in more detail, and so far do not have software to inform that sort of work.
We've had a couple of questions about how this approach could be used in the context of a group or cluster randomized trial. Linda, you noted in your response to one inquiry that, oh yes, you can do it. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a little bit? How would the approach be adapted? Mm-hmm. Many interventions to address health disparities in particular are multi-level, mm-hmm. usually evaluated with a group or cluster randomized trial or a step mm-hmm. wedge design. Mm-hmm. How might most work if the unit of assignment is, for example, a public housing unit, and the mm-hmm. multi-level intervention was designed to improve diet and physical activity in a low-income population?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to make it sound easy, because whenever you are doing cluster randomization, that's a more complex type of experimental design, but it's not really much more complex than cluster randomized evaluation RCT. Of course, you have more experimental conditions, but aside from that, I mean, you can still randomly assign clusters to conditions in a factorial experiment. Now, I will make, I'll say one caveat, which is you sometimes are in a situation where you have a large enough N to power the study, but you may not have enough aggregate units to populate all of the experimental conditions in a factorial experiment. And in that case, you might want to consider a fractional factorial experiment. Now, a fractional factorial experiment is just like an ordinary factorial experiment, except it involves fewer experimental conditions, usually a fraction, like half of the number of experimental conditions. Exact same overall sample size requirements. So there's no removing those experimental conditions does not save you anything in terms of sample size, but it does mean that you would be able to populate, very often you would be able to populate the experimental design. There are several articles, there have been several articles written on this topic. We also have an article on another topic that I think is pretty interesting, and one that's often ignored. It's related to this. That's what we call experimenter-induced clustering. That's when a treatment is delivered in a group setting. And so if the treatment is delivered in a group setting over a period of time, even if you randomly assign people to those groups, the interclass correlation might be 0 at time 1, but it's going to grow over time for sure. So that's another example where you would need to take that into account in the design and in the analysis, but it's all completely doable. And it's also, by the way, it's also doable for the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial.
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning what we call individually randomized group treatment trials. They're different. Some people refer to them as partially clustered designs. I've heard different labels, but
yeah,
the whole idea being you start by randomly assigning individuals, and then they receive, at least in the intervention arm, some of their intervention either in small groups or through a shared intervention agent.
Right.
If you look at behavioral intervention trials supported by NIH, these are common as they can be and largely unrecognized as such.
Exactly. Yep. Largely unrecognized. Yep.
Either by the investigators or by the program staff at NIH. Dr. Moyer and I are studying this topic closely these days. So it's very interesting to hear that there are options. Following up on the GRT adaptation, let's say you've got 5 factors, as you did in your example. That's what, 32 cells in a complete factorial, and you want to have 2 or 3 or 4 clusters in each. That's just a lot. So one alternative would be fractional factorial. What are you giving up when you take that approach as opposed to the fully factorial?
Yeah, there's a very nice fractional factorial design, by the way, for 5 factors that cuts the 32 conditions down to 16 experimental conditions. It's a design that I recommend to people a lot. Once you remove half or more of the experimental conditions from a factorial experiment, you no longer can estimate all of the effects. What ends up individually, what ends up happening is effects get combined, or statisticians call this aliasing. So for example, the main effect of factor A might be combined or aliased with a 4-way interaction. So you have to make the assumption that some of the higher order interactions, well, actually all of the higher order interactions in most cases, are negligible in size, not exactly 0 necessarily, but small enough so that they won't disrupt decision making. So that's a trade-off. Some people are not comfortable with that, but it's a trade-off that is made for efficiency. These fractional factorial designs are extremely common in engineering applications, but as I said before, engineering is not the same as behavioral science. If someone is asking me a question, I can't hear it.
Sorry, my fault. There are a number of most trials underway, and maybe they didn't start out thinking about looking at equity as something to optimize on. Is it possible to go back in an existing study and do that? At what point does it become too late?
Yeah, that's a great question. This too is something that we will be exploring in more detail in this next phase of simulation to work out some more precise answers to this. But I will note that in this question, there's a useful acknowledgement that these methods might be relevant for certain trials, and specifically certain trials that involve certain samples. I think it's possible that if there's an existing optimization randomized control trial that has a sufficiently diverse sample, that there might be a useful application of these methods, but it would certainly require variation on the dimensions of advantage that were of interest.
We have a question from our audience. Would you recommend that interventions not be implemented as one size fits all? Maybe the better approach is that different patient groups receive the intervention that is shown to give them the best net health value. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, this is a really big question. And I will also note that there are some important controversies in this. So the notion of tailoring what intervention somebody is given as a function of, say, their score on a continuous measure of relative advantage is something that, when put into practice, might be a controversial thing and something for society at large to sort of think about. However, it's certainly true that the methods that we were describing here might identify information that is useful for that line of thinking. So, for instance, if it's found that a particular component really concentrates its benefits among individuals who are lower in relative advantage, at least as measured in this study, I think that that sort of finding might contribute nicely to a continual optimization process that perhaps uses that component in future work to develop interventions that might be useful for certain subgroups of the population or for certain individuals. But I'll also just note finally that there is some value in taking on sort of the portfolio optimization perspective with interventions of maybe it is useful to not just pick one that gets delivered to everybody, but rather to think of a collection of interventions that may offer different benefits to different groups. And that's something certainly to be thought through more in using some of these results.
We're starting to run short on time, so let me ask just one more question. What are the next things that you two want to do with MOST? Where's this going to go? Moving into optimization for health equity was a new direction. Adopting Bayesian methods, I know, is a new direction. Where is your work headed?
Yeah, both of those areas for sure. In fact, we are hoping in the next few years to go Bayesian in a really big way, because we believe that the kind of assertively decision-oriented approach that we take in MOST is very consistent with the Bayesian perspective on things. And we are working really hard at developing translational products, like, more Coursera courses for people to learn about MOST. Currently, as far as we know, there are only 1 or 2 universities across the nation that offer a full semester graduate course in MOST, which means that the vast majority of people are not being exposed to enough of this to enable them to write a successful grant proposal. So we're trying to take on some of that.
The same could be said for group randomized trials.
Yes, absolutely. People don't get, David, yeah, I know. You and I both believe people don't get enough methods in general.
So I know the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Where would you point people if they want to learn more about the MOST approach? I think it's perhaps the slide that we're looking at.
Yeah, I think the slide that we're looking at, us, and also our sister center, the D3 Center, they focus more on adaptive interventions.
I want to thank you both very much for your presentation today and for putting up with all the questions that I've been throwing at you. And I'm going to pass this back to Dr. Moyer.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, and thank you to everyone who participated in today's webinar. On the Mind the Gap website, prevention.nih.gov/mindthegap, you will find several resources for this talk, including the slides and a list of references. We will also be posting a recording of today's webinar on our website in a few weeks. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.